Over the past week, I've been working on making a game. Now, this is not the first time I've started a project like this, and by this I mean a creative endeavor that will likely ultimately be cast aside for a new, more exciting project, or perhaps just grow too complex and collapse in on itself. Now, this time, things are different. I'm taking two measures to try to stay more motivated and actually get this thing done. First is regular devlogs. You're watching the first one right now. Now, I'm usually not one for these kind of trends, but if nothing else, making regular devlogs forces me into a cadence that hopefully will allow me to keep a steady pace. The second is to dream smaller. Now, what I'm applying here, I'm going to call the 10% rule. If you Google that, you'll find something completely unrelated, but that's stupid. Just this is the 10% rule now. I don't remember where I originally heard this, but what I'm calling the 10% rule is basically to achieve something, you do 10% more than what you can accomplish without effort. The truth is, ideas are cheap. Fun, the ideation and brainstorming part of any creative project is, in my opinion at least, the most fun part. But it's really easy to get trapped there in that stage. Execution is everything, right, when it comes to art, because without the execution, you have nothing. It's just an idea in your head, and like I said, ideas are cheap. Effort, willpower, skill, that is what makes art. That's what the 10% rule is all about, of applying yourself, your effort, your willpower, and your skill 10% more, instead of, conceptualizing this grand project that goes way beyond where your skill level actually is or what you can realistically accomplish, especially seeing as I am one person working currently on this game project. So let's talk about the game itself, both as I conceive of it and, more importantly, the execution, what I've actually done in this past week or so. The short version is that this game is a roguelite first-person horde shooter, which may or may not mean anything to you, but think of it as Doom and Quake meet Vampire Survivors, or more accurately, Brotato, which personally I think does the whole so-called bullet heaven thing a little better than Vampire Survivors, but nonetheless, the mood, as I would describe it, is going to basically be blasting demons with a holy shotgun while rock/metal plays in the background. You've probably noticed looking at the footage on your screen, the shotgun is coming soon. I don't have the view model for that yet, so just pretend there's a shotgun shooting these imps here. And I don't have the music yet either. Art and music have always been kind of a barrier for me, at least mentally. Even though I know, I probably could cobble together some crappy art and even worse music and pair it with, my programming and come out with a game. But I have, that perfectionist in me is always like, well, you want it to be better, right? And I guess that perfectionist in me is probably the reason I've never actually finished most of the creative projects I've started. So again, to try to counter that, we're just going to send it, right? We're going to send it. You can't take shortcuts on effort, but what you can do is just make the distance from point A to point B, point A being starting game dev and point B being finishing the game. You can make that distance shorter. Right? It's not a shortcut. You're just decreasing your own workload. Again, the 10% rule. So some ways I'm trying to do that, keeping the overall art style very simple and retro. I mean, you could probably tell by looking at it. If you look at this and you think, well, you say you're bad at art, you can't do art, but this doesn't look terrible. Well, there's a lot of tricks you can do, right? Again, no shortcuts to effort. I can't just make good-looking art and environments overnight, but you can use some tricks. So, for example, having the base rendering resolution of the game be lower, this footage is recorded at either 1080p or 1440p, depending on whether I have it full screen or not, but it probably looks very pixely to you, but that's because the base resolution of the game is actually 360p. A nice side benefit to this particular trick of making it look more pixely and more retro is that the game runs much faster because of it. One of the main things I wanted to talk about for this devlog is one of the guiding principles I'm using as a part of this 10% rule, and that's the old keep it simple, stupid, KISS principle. And I think I've always kind of underestimated the usefulness of simplicity when it comes to creative projects. I have a tendency to overcomplicate things. So as a programmer, a big part of keep it simple, stupid is don't reinvent the wheel. So for this project, I've brought in already, in just the first week, I brought in 3 different add-ons from the Godot asset library. And I've always kind of frowned on using third-party code and plugins for things I could probably write myself. And I don't know why. It's such like an ego thing, I guess. So I'm kind of forcing myself to say, hey, if this functionality already exists somewhere, if someone has already written this functionality, just take their code, right? I mean, assuming I can legally, assuming they've provided it under a permissive license to do so. There's really no reason for me to go out of my way and write things. Like, for example, I basically started this project on day 1 by pulling in the FPS starter kit by Kenny from the Godot asset library, and it sped things up tremendously. You know, I don't have to sit there and think like, okay, how do I do this in 3D? How do I manipulate the camera this way? How do I handle gravity? You know, the work was already done for me. Now, admittedly, I kind of cherry picked the parts I wanted from this starter kit, but it was tremendously helpful, and I was basically able to, on day 1, get a completely working character, a player that can move around. The other 2 packages I pulled in were the debug menu, which you can probably see in some of this footage up in the top right. Handy little add-on to track your frame rate, and also the dev console you might see open up sometimes. Nice little add-on. Again, just little things to help speed up development in whatever ways I can. All the textures you're seeing here are actually from opengameart.org. The one model so far that I've actually used that's not just a basic shape from Godot is the light. This I found on Sketchfab, which I just discovered like yesterday. And so far, I'm really surprised by just how many high quality 3D models are on there for free. One thing I'll say, if you yourself are an aspiring developer, and you're hearing me talk about, oh, there's all these free resources for textures and models. And of course, if you want to go the 2D route, there's tons of sprites. And of course, you can find free sound effects, all kinds of crazy stuff out there for free. But word of warning, be careful with licensing. Basically, what you want to be looking for, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but what you want to be looking for here is Creative Commons CC. So CC 0 is totally open permissions, right? You can use it for free in commercial products, and you don't even have to give attribution to the creator if you don't want to. The other type of license you might want to look out for is Creative Commons, but it's not 0, it's CC BY is how it's usually abbreviated. It's basically Creative Commons version 4, or if it's older, version 3. And the BY just means attribution is required. You can use it in commercial projects for, there's no stipulation there. But you do need to credit the creator somewhere. So again, if you're watching this and thinking, oh, okay, well, he's got a point, I should speed up my game development by pulling in as many free assets made by other people as I can. Well, obviously, be careful with that, because you don't want to end up with a essentially an asset flip, right? You want some of your own identity in the game. And I'm planning to do that with the enemies and things like items and the shotgun and stuff like that. But I'll talk about that in a bit. All that to say, there are resources out here, and I'm not going to shy away from using them. Part of what changed my thinking on this is actually Vampire Survivors. They mentioned sort of offhand comment in the one of their posts, I think, about the first DLC they released for that game. They said something about using third-party assets. I was like, Vampire Survivors, it's a really big name now. It's like they've got a freaking Among Us crossover coming up. Like this is not just some random indie game with 3 Steam reviews, right? Like this is huge, and they are using third-party assets to speed up their game development. If they're not above it, why should I be? Especially when I suck at art and music. Anyway, continuing with this theme of keep it simple, stupid, let's talk about the level that we're looking at here. This is really my first endeavor with 3D environments. So my goal, again, thinking about the 10%, I'm not going to create super big, complicated, intricate levels. We're going to start simple. And that works because I want the first level of this game to be very straightforward. So this first level, I call it corpse processing. Basically, we're in this big metal pipe or tube or a basin of some kind. And there's a grate running through that the player is walking on. And it forms, because of this pillar in the center, it forms a kind of donut circular shape, which lends nicely to kind of training, to use a Call of Duty Zombies term, training the hordes of enemies around the center. So very simple design lends itself to kind of learning how to manage a horde. At least that's the idea. We'll see how it plays out when we actually spin up like waves of enemies and all the different enemy types. Right now, we really just have this imp that you're looking at here. Right, let's talk about the imp for a bit. A lot of indie developers seem to be under this impression that your game has to be, at least when we're talking about 2D, which even though this game is 3D, the imp and all the enemies are going to be billboard 2D sprites, right? So for some reason, indie developers think, oh, it's got to be pixel art, right? That's the indie style, right? And I think the main reason a lot of indie developers lean that way, and I myself have been guilty of thinking this, is they think, oh, well, pixel art, I can do that, right? Like traditional art, oh, you got to know how to like draw, but pixel art, it's small, you can just like click the dots in. I think there's a misunderstanding here. Pixel art is not actually any easier, right? There's constraints. Basically, I'm getting all this. I watched a video from a YouTube channel called Nonsensical 2D, and I don't want to repeat all his points. I'll link his video on pixel art versus more traditional art for game dev. It's a really interesting video, and it changed my perspective on how to approach art for games, and it made me realize, like, okay, just think of it as shapes, right? Keep it simple, stupid. Pixel art is actually a lot harder to represent shapes, right? So I can draw a circle, though. Well, I can't draw a perfect circle without some assistance from a photo editing program or something. But hey, that's what Krita is for, right? So one thing, though, about this is people will point out, hey, well, animation, right? Animation is a lot easier with pixel art than more traditional hand-drawn stuff. And that's generally true, but hey, again, keep it simple, stupid. Here's your animation. Design your characters so that animating them is easy. I'm not some sort of genius for coming up with this trick. I'm pretty sure this has been done. I think Doom actually does something very similar to this. I can't really remember, but I have some other ideas for enemies in mind, and I'm going to be, wherever possible, looking for ways to make the animation simple. Because yeah, animating is hard generally. In particular, it can be difficult to animate traditional hand-drawn stuff. So I'm going to be looking for ways to minimize the amount of complex animation that needs to be done for any of my characters. So again, keep it simple. Another great example, when it comes to art and keeping it simple, I'm using billboard sprites, right? So probably the game most everyone will be familiar with that uses billboard sprites, original Doom and Doom 2. Well, in Doom, the billboard sprites are actually 8-directional. So even though they're flat, there's all the animations for the enemies have 8 different versions depending on which angle you're looking at them from. It's a simulation of the 3D effect on a 2D sprite. Very clever trick. I'll do you one better. Why do you need 8 directions when the enemies are all going to be looking at your player all the time anyway? Right? Obviously, Doom has like aggro and stealth mechanics, very primitive compared to modern games. And of course, they have infighting. That's another good reason to have the 8 directions. In my case, my weakness, my limit is my art, right? And I don't really want to I don't want my 10% to be, oh, okay, I got to redraw this imp from 8 different angles. Kind of sounds like a pain in the butt. So I'm not going to do it. Instead, my enemies are just going to be facing the player the whole time. It doesn't even look that bad, and it makes sense. If you look at Vampire Survivors, it's a very similar idea. Obviously, it's even simpler because it's 2D, but the enemy is facing right if the player is to the right of them, and the enemy is facing left if the player is to the left of them, and they're just flipping the sprite based on the direction the player is from the enemy. I mean, you really can't make it much simpler than that. So far, I have a few more ideas for enemies in mind, and none of them really need to be able to look away from the player, right? It's a small arena. The enemies are always just going to be moving towards the player. Or, I might have more advanced behavior like circling around the player, or like standing at a distance and shooting at them with projectiles, that kind of thing. There's no real reason to redraw these sprites from 8 different directions because, just design it so you don't need to. Keep it simple. I want to talk briefly about what's next, right? So there's not a lot of game going on here. I'll be first to admit that. You're just kind of running, like the enemies can't attack you. And they just kind of spawn indefinitely. There's no win condition. There's no lose condition. Can't even see the gun you're shooting. I'm proud of what I did in my first week, but I got to keep on this this cadence, right? So for the next week, I'm hoping to get the shotgun view model in, so you can actually see the gun you're shooting. I want to do more wave logic, and by that I mean being able to actually like clear a wave. I probably won't have the wave system fully fleshed out in the next week, but it is something I want to develop further because it's probably the most important part of the game from a programming perspective, because it is the game essentially. And then obviously I also want the enemies to be able to actually damage the player. I don't like contact damage generally in games. So I don't want the player to take damage like as they're walking through enemies. Instead, I want the enemies to actually have like attack animations, and I know I just said I'm gonna minimize the amount of animations, but I have some ideas for having visible attack animations that are simple to draw, or maybe I can pull in some resources from elsewhere. But I also want to have more than one type of enemy. I'm not sure if I'm going to get to that next week, but I do have an idea for the next enemy I want to do. I'm hoping to get another one of these out here within the next week and a half maybe. So yeah, keep me to it. If I slack off and don't post a devlog, make sure you leave an angry comment and tell me to stick to these principles I've set out here and actually get this thing done. My hope is I can have something playable at the end of the month, but we'll see. That's sort of a stretch goal right now.
Sorry about the audio issue there. I think Audacity kind of gave up halfway through my recording session. But if you made it this far, even with the audio issue, I guess I must have had something worthwhile to say. So it would really help me out if you could, engage with the video a little bit, like, subscribe, and all that. I'm just a guy. I'm not really trying to make money on YouTube or whatever. But the more engagement with the video, the higher it pumps the numbers and the black magic of the algorithm. So thanks for sticking around, and I'll see you guys next time.